that you joined us today, and we're particularly pleased to have a terrific speaker today, Dr. Sally Darney, who is the editor-in-chief of Environmental Health Perspectives. Dr. Darney is going to be talking about publishing environmental health research with tips for authors, and we're so honored to have somebody who can provide such terrific insights into something that I'm sure many of you are focused on and interested in, which is publishing your research in peer-reviewed journals. Dr. Darney has been with the Office of Research and Development at the US EPA for a number of years, and throughout her career, she's accrued a comprehensive experience in environmental research and research management. She's been the editor of several scholarly journals, including the one that she'll talk about today, and other governance responsibilities. She has published extensively as a bench scientist with a concentration in reproductive toxicology, environmental epidemiology, and children's health, and has contributed to the EPA test and risk assessment guidelines and served on a number of interagency panels. While program director in the ORD, she helped shape 2 new EPA national research programs, Chemical Safety for Sustainability and Sustainable and Healthy Communities. So not only is she now overseeing the editing of other people's research, but she is a renowned scientist in her own right. She received her PhD from the University of Hawaii and completed a postdoc fellowship at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health before she joined the EPA. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Darney for today's talk. So thank you very much for being here today with us, Dr. Darney.
Well, I'm delighted to be, and I want to thank you and Kristen both for this opportunity. As you were saying, I'm speaking on behalf of VHP, but also other excellent journals in the field, because as an editor, we all want to see well-written papers, and we want to publish the best science. I also want to acknowledge the wonderful staff with whom I work here, who are PhD scientists and professional science writers. Every Tuesday, we tweet tips for authors, and I've borrowed a lot of input from them in this presentation. So this is for everybody to hopefully benefit from over the next hour. And I'll start with just a simple summary of our goals at EHP, which I'm sure are similar to yours. We want to publish the most important and reliable environmental health research. We also publish reviews, news, and commentaries. We want to translate that new environmental knowledge to the broad environmental health science community in ways that researchers and knowledge users can understand, and make it readily discoverable and freely accessible globally via the internet. So I'm preparing for this talk. I looked up your website for the Protect Superfund Research Program and saw so many interests in common that I thought I'd use this slide to remind everybody that we work in a very transdisciplinary and multidisciplinary field. And some people specialize in epidemiology or mechanistic toxicology, exposure sciences, data management and modeling, chemical fate and transport, and of course for Superfund, the green remediation program is paramount. So we find that there are applications that cross over into many public spheres, and that's our audience whom we're trying to reach, of regulators, decision makers, the public health policy makers, and people in communities who can make decisions that change the environment and therefore improve public health. So we have a lot in common, and therefore I want today's session to be helpful. You can ask questions at any time. If you use the chat function, I believe Kristen will help moderate that for me. I've targeted it mainly on tips and myths to help authors write papers, and that involves kind of stepwise going through the process of getting ready before you start actually writing the paper by sections. And then finally, a little bit about submitting a peer review process and then how to operationalize or promote your work. So getting prepared. We recommend investigating several journals beforehand. Read the journal websites. You know, we always joke that nobody reads the instructions, but based on some of the papers we receive, it's apparently true. So read the journal, look at the website, look at the aims and scope on the website. Is your work really well suited to that particular journal? Take a look at the editors and the editorial reports for people you know, your colleagues, people you cite in your work, and make sure they have the expertise that's specific to your research. And then consider whether the journal meets your particular individual needs. Maybe you have a limited publication cost budget. Maybe the journal impact factor is the most important thing to you. Maybe timeliness is more important. Maybe policies of the journal in terms of peer review and revision criteria are most important. So think about all those things. You should be able to find information about that on any journal's website. Then I recommend you sign up for notifications from that journal if you're not already getting them. You'll get Facebook alerts, Twitter feed about new articles, and it will get you familiar with the journal and what their expectations are. Of course, you can access previous versions as well. And I wanted to mention that many journals have really good tutorials, and if the journal doesn't, go to some of the big publishing companies, Elsevier, Wiley, OUP, these who publish in our field. A lot of them have very nice tutorials on writing papers. Plus, you can, Christian will give you access to these slides if you would like to look at them later. So we just talked about websites. This is a screenshot of ours a couple of months ago. I wanted to point out a couple of things. First of all, on the lower left, EHP is fairly unique. We're freely accessible online, funded entirely by the federal government, which to some extent frees us from some constraints. We don't have to have a lot of subscribers. We don't have to attract papers from authors who can afford to pay the open access fee. But on the other hand, we have a real responsibility being published with support from NIEHS to really insist upon excellence. And all of you have successfully competed for funding from NIEHS, so I'm sure you share this commitment that we want to publish with the highest standards and principles in mind. So our peer review procedure is pretty strict in that regard because we do insist on publishing only papers that really are reliable and dependable and provide very accurate information. You can also see on the lower right, there's usually a button on any website where you can subscribe to email alerts, get Twitter feeds, and so on. And then at the, I don't know if you can see my pointer, but most websites have something about the journal, and they have the author section that has detailed instructions, and those vary quite a bit from journal to journal on how to submit and what the editor expects for different journals. So one of the myths that's flying around now and has been for a while that you should always start with the journal with the highest impact factor. I call that a myth because it can steer you wrong. It's okay if your paper is a high impact paper. High impact journals who triage usually 75 to 85% or maybe more of new submissions are looking for papers that make really novel or substantial advances in the field. There are plenty of well-respected journals with perhaps lower impact factors that may be a better choice for your study if it's one that makes a modest advance, if it confirms previous work, it's still important, but lacks that punch of novelty. if it's specific to a given group or location or context, it may be better for a lower impact journal. Or if it's really of most interest in a very specialized field, it may be more widely read in a specialized journal, even though that journal has a lower impact factor. So that's why I recommended up front to look at a number of journals and be realistic. It's fine to submit to a high impact journal, but it does take time and it's going to delay your publication should it get turned down, and then you have to start over. So here's some general tips when you sit down to write your paper. These are mostly common sense, but I repeat them because I find them helpful. Try to stay on message, know what your message is, and stick with it. Express yourself in clear and concise language. Don't assume that the readers already know what you're talking about or that they can read between the lines. Be direct. Don't hesitate to repeat key points multiple times. These can be reiterated in several sections, although I'll go through what you really need in each section of the paper. So why you did this study, what your key findings are, and what are their implications. Be nice to your reader. Make it easy to read. Avoid long paragraphs. Have good topic sentences. These are just general principles. And then go back over it and evaluate whether each sentence, whether it could be simpler, could it be shorter, is it really clear? And finally, particularly in a high-impact journal, avoid jargon and acronyms. You're talking to a broad audience who may not know them, and it can be very distracting to somebody not in your field to have to keep going back and looking up what your acronyms are. So we encourage authors to use acronyms sparingly. We also find the active voice is more concise, less wordy, easier to follow, and it also keeps repeatedly indicating who's responsible for the action being described. So using, we undertook this study too, we used these cells too, we found that, we interpret that, is much more interesting than the passive voice, and many journals are now promoting that. So let's turn to the sort of fundamental architecture of a scientific paper. Each section is discrete and unique, but feeds into the next one, and in the end should all revert back to the title. So I put this in very simple terms. Essentially, your title should tell the reader what's it about. Then the introduction should be, why do we need to know this? Why should I read this? Then the methods is, okay, what is, now that, we have this idea for this project, what did we actually do? And then in the results, what did we find out? And in the discussion, then go back and reflect upon what the findings mean, what are they, does it matter, and what are the next steps? I mean, this sounds like sort of ABC, but it's surprising how many papers we get where we find conclusions in the introduction, we find results in the methods, and the discussion may go back and reiterate all the methods. So you want to really think about making it easier for the reader by keeping these sections clearly defined and orderly. So you notice I didn't put the abstract in that diagram, and that's because I wanted to make the point that we recommend you write the abstract last. What I've found is a lot of people, if they presented something as an abstract at a meeting, will just clip in that abstract. But after they've reflected on the data, the actual bottom line message may actually be different than what they presented. And you want to structure it in a way that really talks about the study. It's different than the way you would structure it for a scientific meeting where you might want to put more data in the abstract. So I recommend people to think this may be the only thing people read. So use it to report the key findings, the methods and results very simply, but in enough detail that when you get to the conclusion, people aren't wondering, oh, what did you do to get to that conclusion? So let's step through these with some points and suggestions for you. I kind of use myth here to be the misconceptions that a lot of people have that we see. And one of them is titles that boldly declare your results. I think people think this will entice the reader. I put an example at the bottom. Exposure to bisphenol A causes uterine cancer. Okay, what's the risk of that? Yeah, it might attract the media, but then that may be all that's tweeted, and it's completely out of context of your study. It oversimplifies and actually minimizes the value of your study because it's out of context. And it can often mislead or even alarm the public who are reading this tweet or this headline. And for critical scientists, it may actually undermine your credibility in the scientific community because you've just oversimplified and overextended the results. So we recommend using descriptive titles that state the subject and topic of the paper very clearly and objectively, include information to help the readers determine whether the paper is related to their interests. So this is where you want the title to help the reader know, do I want to sit down, do I want to download this paper first of all and read it? Does it include exposures and outcomes that are addressed in the paper and whether the paper was observational or experimental? This also can help attract readers. So we recommend a certain level of detail in the title. If it's an epidemiological study, for example, you can provide the key characteristics of the study population. If it's a cohort study, it might have a name, and you like what's the matter with me? The name of your project. The location. You know, we studied this cohort of people in Puerto Rico, and we were interested in looking at the outcome of premature birth, for example. All of that can be put into a very concise title, and it really provides a lot of information. For experimental studies, we look for whether the name of the species is included, if it's an animal study, or if it's an in vitro study, the type of cells, and of course, the outcomes of interest would be in there too. So moving on to the introduction, I think of the introduction as being the motivation for the paper. Why did you do this study? What is the problem? How do you define the problem? And is it clear? Is it compelling? Does anybody care about it? That's going to suck the reader in and really prepare them for the rest of the paper and even set up why they care about your conclusions. It should also provide enough background to kind of set up your methods. So you want to cover, but fairly briefly, what do we already know that led you to propose this question or hypothesis? Generally, you can start out general and get more specific. But we really look for you to cite key original research that's relevant to your question. If you're looking at bisphenol A and pregnancy outcome, you don't want to report every other thing that bisphenol A does in the introduction. It might be relevant in the discussion, the comparison, but in the introduction, you want to frame it around your outcome of interest. And what is the existing evidence? And is it in people? Is it in human studies? Does it come only from animals or cells? Be very specific when you talk about where that evidence comes from. That's being critical and accurate. And identify key knowledge gaps, which then leads to your stating your objectives, which generally are to fill the knowledge gap by doing several specific things. You may add how you approach the question, such as to address this question, we designed an epidemiology study, or to look for the mechanism of this chemical, we designed a rat study, and that kind of sets up the next stage. But but the introduction should not summarize the results or draw conclusions. This can vary by journal. Some journals like you to do that. EHP does not. We feel the introduction should not bias the reader. It should motivate the reader to read on and form their own conclusions with you at the end. Methods are an area of huge attention today. Lots is being published on reproducibility, transparency, and reporting. So think, could someone in my field recreate this study exactly as I have done it? Have I given them all the information they need to do that? That's what we look for. If it's an experimental study, for example, we find it very helpful to start with an overview of the study design. This will show the reader your logic and how you progress through a series of experiments in order to answer the question. That then provides a context or a framework for the reader, and then you can go on and talk about the details of every outcome, assay, or element. So you've got this sort of study design up front piece, and then the details for each piece of it.
Sally, this is Kristen. Just one question. What if the methodologies are proprietary or could lead to a patent?
That's a really good question. You know, if you're publishing a peer-reviewed paper, you've got to provide enough information that the study can be reproduced. So it's possible it's not the right place to publish it, or you have to get the paperwork in for the patent first and time it so that you don't shoot yourself in the foot. But it's not an excuse for not being thorough, because if you really want to show something, you've got to say everything you did. And that might not be a very satisfactory answer. Maybe we could come back to that at the end if not.
Thank you.
Okay. In experimental studies, it's surprising how often we go back and we say, wait a minute, they never justified the dose. And we don't look for a dose as being, well, we used this in our previous study, so we're using it again. It really needs to be in the context of, if not real-world exposures, at least some regulatory limit, at least some reasonable dose that makes sense biologically. You're not just poisoning the animals with it. Sample size, very explicitly, if you do a bunch of different experiments, so they all have the same sample size. We have to know for each one what that sample size is. Time courses sometimes are unclear, the duration of dosing or the time between dosing and observations. And, you know, details on the statistical analysis with justification for selecting the test that you select. For epidemiology studies, and by the way, our science editor, Jane Schroeder, gives a whole separate course on this, so I'm being a bit brief, but you want to at least provide the type of study, the design. There's a cohort study, for example, details of the participant recruitment and selection criteria for that population. What is your sampling strategy? What are the characteristics of the study population, such as age, sex, is it located in one area, is it representative across the country, details of the exposure assessment, and of course the outcome assessment or assessments, and full details of the analysis plan. Again, I'm being very brief as an overview here in the interest of time, but there's a lot to this, and there's a lot more guidance that you can access. So there are groups of people that have gotten together and created reporting guidelines. You probably already know about these, but in case not, here's a website that pulls them all together. It's called the equatornetwork.org. And the ones that we see most in environmental health studies are stroke guidelines for observational studies, the ARRIVE guidelines for animal studies, and PRISMA guidelines for systematic reviews. These provide a lot more detail than what I'll be talking about today, and they each have checklists that are very helpful. I've heard that the ARRIVE group is also working on some guidelines for experimental studies with cells or other than animal studies, because many of these have the same reporting criteria for knowing the reagents, the study design, the N, the statistics, all the characteristics of everything you did. So I'm feeling like I'm repeating myself here, but highly recommend looking into these. And in fact, I would hope that most graduate programs in environmental health cover this in their coursework. So beware of myths that are common in methods that you can assume, oh, everybody already knows how to do this assay, I don't have to give details, or, oh, I can just cite a previous paper, even though I tweaked it a little bit, does it matter? Yes, it matters, because if you tweaked it and somebody used the previous paper, they probably wouldn't get the same results, and then it wouldn't be reproducible. People sometimes say, oh, I can stick most of the stuff in the supplement. We want everything in the methods that's used to create the data that's used to draw the conclusions. That's full transparency. Another thing that I think is that we've inherited is the idea of being brief in methods because of page charges. When journals were published in paper and you had to pay per page, but you didn't have to pay for the supplemental materials. Now in today's electronic age, that's not an excuse anymore. Put everything that's really needed in methods, put it there. If reviewers want to cut it, it's a lot easier to cut it. But if you submit a paper that's not fully reported, the editor might say, well, I can't send this to reviewers because I don't see enough information here for them to evaluate whether the work was done right. So they'll either send it back to you and ask you to revise it or just reject it outright. So that's a word to the wise. As for supplemental material, it's okay for certain things don't really need to be in the methods section. And again, most journals will give you specific guidance on this. We recommend for supplemental material things like lists of reagents, gene probes, genes, sequences, some details of the laboratory methods that depends on what it is. Sometimes model equations for unusual or new analytical methods, although again, these, depending how important they are to your conclusions, may be preferred in the main text.
Sally, just one question going back to your last slide. Do you think in the future there will be more video submissions of methods like in Jove?
Oh, I heard some comments on that at a recent, on a recent webinar, and people really like that idea, although they said sometimes it's really hard to get something in Jove because it has to be really expertly done. I love them, and I know EHP will publish them, but not as at this time, not as a standalone, but as an adjunct. So now most electronic journals will let you add a video, and readers can find it very helpful, but it doesn't substitute for also the written method.
Thanks.
In EPI studies, some of the sensitivity analyses may be better suited for the adjunct, and for genomics data, which is vast, it can often be put in a well-established repository, and you can link to it, but you can put it in the supplement as well. A word of caution, some journals don't, I think, include, or in the past may not have included all their supplemental material in PubMed Central, although I think PubMed Central is now requiring it. So you do want that stuff to be accessible in perpetuity, so just be careful with that. Okay, let's a few tips on publication ethics. It's mainly just to make sure you put the required text in there, that you have approval for care and use of animals and for human studies. Our journal requires a conflicting financial interest disclosure. Doesn't mean you can't have those interests, it just means you need to disclose them. And then we refer you to COPE guidelines for all sorts of other publication ethics issues. So this is their website. You can see there's intellectual property issues, authorship and contributorship issues, complaints, appeals, and so on. There's a lot of material there. In reporting the results, so flipping back to as you're writing, we recommend you use the past tense. This makes it clear it's specific to what you did and what you found. We recommend sections that mirror the analysis you performed, or sections that mirror what the order in the methods, that you use objective subheadings. There tends to be a habit that some people have of using subheadings that really state conclusions instead of the results, so be careful about that. It's better to just have the subheading be a what rather than a conclusion. Make sure you refer to the tables and figures in order. These are pretty routine things. Don't repeat data unnecessarily in the text, but make sure you report all the results used to draw conclusions. We see this a lot, authors assuming, oh, I can put the negative results in supplemental material. Again, I think part of this is not necessarily trying to hide them, but rather trying to save space and page charges. It's no longer relevant and no longer acceptable. In the interest of real reproducibility, we are moving towards requiring that people put most, if not all, their data in tables so that the summary data with the variance terms and the ends is clear, and allowing anybody to reproduce replicate the analysis and get the same results from your data. For figures, if you use figures, we recommend including tables with the information that went into the figure in table form in the supplement, again, so that any interested reader could replicate your analysis. And for figures, think standalone. You want that figure to be able to stand alone. So the caption needs to be very complete so that any reader could follow it without going back and reading the methods or the results. Let's see. I guess I'm okay with time. So discussion, possibly, you know, if you've done everything else right, then this is really the linchpin that holds the whole paper together and makes it important. And also easy for the reader to recapture briefly what was your question and objectives. It's kind of similar to the last paragraph of the introduction. Remind the reader what this is all about. Don't rehash all the results, but briefly summarize your major findings, particularly those that are most relevant to your study question or aim. You can't assume readers will remember or know what was most important, so don't hesitate to point that out. Help the reader along, but don't over-interpret your data. For example, people tend to call associations effects, which implies causation that the study probably doesn't show. And also make sure that the findings apply to your study population. Specify that in this cohort, for example, we found this, not we found this so it's true throughout the world and across all people. So once you've kind of summarized your findings, then it's good to reflect on how they are interpreted with respect to what we already know. What are your findings in the context of similar studies? Did they find similar things? If the study was, were your findings consistent with what others have shown? And if so, does your study add to it? Is it adding something important to the weight of evidence? Is it adding something new? Is it creating more evidence so that you're more sure of the association? But if the findings are different, then what might explain this? And then how does your study perhaps improve on or complement the previous studies? Is it larger? Perhaps you used a different population. Your study design might be stronger. Point that out and say why. You may have better exposure data, more refined, more specific per person. Point that out. You may have lower exposures. Is the exposure level more relevant to what people are exposed to, and so on. In discussing your work with respect to others, it's really important to distinguish between experimental and observational evidence, and whether that was in vivo or in vitro. We find that some authors really blur this. They talk about their study may have been in animals, and it's similar to previous data that showed X, Y, and Z, but the previous data might have been in people, for example. And it's very easy to just point that out with the reference. Be very specific and very clear. Of course, don't selectively report studies that support your findings. Good reviewers will pick up on that right away and really ding you for it. And avoid excessive speculation and extrapolation. If you want to speculate, say, well, based on this study, we speculate that, but it needs further study.
Sally, another question. Should future work be talked about in this section?
Yes, I think I hope I have that here. So let me move on, and I'll come back to that. So that's usually kind of at the end. Okay, if we know this, now what do we need to do next? So you do want to point out strengths and limitations. The strengths usually speak for themselves, so just state them simply and clearly, and say how it adds or shifts the evidence, but do this straightforward and honestly, and don't inflate it. And then the limitations, point those out and don't make excuses. This shows your objectivity. So, for example, it's kind of, here's a bad example. Quote, precision was limited due to small numbers of cases, but we didn't have enough funding to collect additional data. Okay, the dog ate my homework. It's not an excuse. It's much better to just say precision was limited due to small numbers of cases. That's what the reality was. So then, if you get to, let's see, let me see if I did that. Okay, good. Kudos for the person who spoke up, because I thought I had this in here. In the concluding paragraph, you can remind readers of the need for cautious interpretation, the need for confirmation in other study populations, express the conclusions in the context of your study, and don't overstate. I've kind of said all of that already, but what I left out here is another bullet that said, okay, if this is true, what do we need to do next? Did this fill a gap? Yes, but did it open three other gaps? Probably. So say what those are, and I think it's altogether appropriate. Now, if you're already doing that, we discourage people from saying, we've already got preliminary information that says, that fills this gap, data not shown. We don't allow that in the HP. Some journals might, but rather we could say, you could say this gap needs to be filled. For example, we're currently doing studies looking at X on Y. So thank you for bringing that up. That's important. Now, since I spend half my life doing peer review, I'd be remiss not to give you a couple of tips on that. We recommend that when you submit your paper, you actually list some suggest some qualified reviewers. You want to be careful not to appear that you're stacking the deck. Don't ask your buddies, don't ask people who might have a conflict of interest or might be in your same department. Those, are not good choices, but rather people that you think are qualified, even if they'd be tough on you. Make sure when you respond to the reviewer's comments, when you get them, that you respond to all of them. Don't gloss over any. Consider each one. You can respond to all in your letter back to the editor, and then most of them in the manuscript itself. So what we sometimes see is an author will elaborate on a reviewer comment to the editor, but not change the manuscript. And that is, it's risking a real loss of value, because if the reviewer doesn't understand something, other readers probably won't either. So, of course, if the reviewer's comment is not valid, you're not going to change the paper and make it wrong, but you should respond to the editor about why it's not valid, and that's perfectly acceptable. And then, of course, be respectful and appreciate the input. Editors keep decrying the fact that it's so hard to find good reviewers because everybody's so busy writing their own papers. So really appreciate the input you're getting from somebody who's really volunteered their time and expertise to help make the paper better. And then finally, after acceptance, promote your work. We have a section on our in our Author Hub that gives suggestions for doing this in today's world, and here are a few of those listed here. Look into whether your institutional public affairs office would help you put out a press release. Often this has to be coordinated with the journal. For example, EHP publishes a paper as soon as it's ready. So we publish papers at any time of the month. And if you're going to issue a press release, you want to arrange to embargo that paper so it comes out on the day that the press release does. And you have to work with the journal office to arrange that. You can tweet about your own work, and a lot of publishers will tweet about the articles and look for those tweets and then retweet them. You can add your paper to your profile in LinkedIn and send out a message to your followers. Oh, read my latest paper on this and this or this. So these are just some suggestions. And I'm aware that we've got about 10 minutes for discussion. So
Sally,
I'm going to stop there.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, so I'm going to stop there and turn it back over to Kristen and to people to ask questions.
Yeah, one other question we had was on reviews. What if you detect that a reviewer, is someone who has an axe to grind with you? You know who they are because of their comments and know they're not unbiased. How do you deal with that type of a situation?
I would contact the editor with that if you have concerns, because that's kind of an ethics concern. Yeah, of course, you're still guessing, because if it's a journal that has single blind reviews, the editor's not even supposed to confirm or deny. You're second guessing who the reviewer is. I had one case where an author was really upset and concerned and called me and asked me right out, I think it was so-and-so. And I looked up, I said, you know, I'm not going to tell you who it was, but in fact it wasn't so-and-so, because I felt that was important to then help them open up and really listen to the criticism. I mean, that's just as egregious as any kind of harassment and bullying in the workplace. It's totally unfair for any reviewer to unfairly criticize a paper and affect somebody's career. So editors may or may not be able to do a whole lot. They may be able to get, especially if the review conflicts with other reviews, it's not uncommon for the editor or the associate editor to seek another referee, or even sort of an arbitrating reviewer or another associate editor to look at it. And but it's just really important to point that out, because we want authors to come away feeling that they had a very objective, fair, and helpful peer review. Even if the paper gets rejected in the end, if you pay attention to the comments, you'll probably make it better and it will just fly into another journal without any problem. So I hope that answered your question. I wouldn't ignore any concerns like that, and it's entirely appropriate to contact the editor. Usually you can do it through the manuscript submission system or directly via email.
Great, thank you. Any other questions online, either that people want to ask them directly themselves by coming off mute, or that they want to chat to Protect P42 Center?
It's hard, you know, to talk to a telephone. I can't see who's out there, so I really would appreciate if you have some questions, and I thank the people that did ask questions. And, you know, also, if you have suggestions on improving this, send them to Kristen. If this was all if it was too rudimentary, we want to know if it was helpful, what was helpful, because we talk to a lot of groups, and it's not just me. Our science editors also go out and talk to groups, and you know, we want to be helpful and all for the good of science.
So, Sally, this is Tom Sheehan again. Unfortunately, you're right. With a webinar, you can't see reactions. So I'll just say that a lot of people laughed when you talked about a lack of data due to our funding running out. So that was, but also along the way, a lot of nods about how good the tips were for people, no matter whether they're doing their initial efforts at publishing, and especially things like looking up which is an appropriate journal to actually publish in, rather than thinking right away that you want to go for Science or Nature. And then the other parts about how to write the specific sections were really, really good reminders for experienced folks, and great tips for getting started for those that are just starting their publication careers. So I thought it was really well received here in Boston, and I'm sure across the other listeners who are on the line today. So maybe we'll do one more check with Kristen to see if there's any other questions.
Yeah, I don't have any others online. You answered the ones that we were given, Sally, so thank you. We really appreciate you taking the time.
Well, you know, I want to add to that for training programs, and this was a discussion the National Academy of Sciences had a series of meetings on reproducibility and translation. They really called for a cultural change, I think, that starts with training programs and includes journal editors for really improving the need for transparency and replication and clear methods. So I would encourage any training program like your program up at Northeastern with the students to maybe cover this in a journal club, some of this material. I think I learned more about how to write a paper actually by reviewing papers. Sometimes it's easier to see the mistakes other people make than your own. So that's also a little, I meant to put that in the presentation too, to, you know, before you start, be in a journal club, and that way you can really look to see, well, what did I really like about this paper? What did the authors do right, or what did they do wrong? So thank you all again for this opportunity to talk with you, and that nice positive feedback. And I can take criticism too. I raised 2 teenagers, so.
Sally,
you know,
I saw that we had one question that came through, but this is just a question if the presentation will be distributed to people who attended. And what we will do is we've recorded this session, so we will send, the recording will be posted on our website, but then we'll send an announcement to the people who registered and are online so that they know that it's out there if they would like to see it.
Terrific.
Good. Thanks again, Sally, from all of us here at Protect and across the EPA and SRP communities. Thank you.
Well, you're welcome, and good luck with your research. Okay. Bye-bye.